all over the place. Now, here he is, a little bit about Jack Johnson personally. He liked to dress good. He is like, I got into Teddy Roosevelt's personal life a little bit too. Well, Jack Johnson, also a really interesting guy. And, you know, a lot of history teachers will cover somebody, a Teddy Roosevelt or maybe a Adolf Hitler, and they'll put somebody in the good guy camp or the bad guy camp. Well, I had told you before that I don't think there really are good guys and bad guys. I think all humans are somewhere on a spectrum, and they're capable of good things and bad things. And some people do a lot more good stuff, some people a lot more bad stuff. But I think most people that are the most interesting aren't clearly in one category or way to one end of the spectrum or the other. Roosevelt, I think, is like that. I think he's mostly a good guy, but he definitely has some, like even on race or a variety of different things, he has some backwards views and he made some mistakes in his life. Well, Jack Johnson, man, he is this too, because he is not the sports hero that moms would want their kids to idolize. He was a really good athlete, but he also was a party animal. He would go out there. He loved to spend money. Once he started making it and winning these fights, he always wanted to dress good. He always wanted to have the nicest cars. And then the other thing that he does that is by far the most taboo thing he does as somebody that is in the public spotlight, he likes white women. Now, back at that time, a lot of states down south actually had laws that blacks and whites couldn't marry each other. Up north, they typically didn't have the laws, but it was very taboo. It's an extreme rarity that you would see a mixed couple, an interracial couple. So apparently Jack Johnson loved white women. And I think part of it was the taboo end of it. And he probably just generally found some white girls that he actually liked and wanted to hook up with. He loved going to the brothels. He was a womanizer. He was hooking up with women right and left. I believe he was married 3 times in his life, and all 3 were white women. So today that wouldn't be as big a deal. It's become very normalized and kind of a mainstream thing that's accepted. Back then, like, remember, the number one thing that a black guy would get lynched for down south back in this era was doing something inappropriate with a white woman. Even if it was just a perceived inappropriate thing, just looking at a white woman the wrong way, saying the wrong comment to her, that could get you drug out of your house in the middle of the night and brutally murdered and burned and hung by your neck as an example to the whole community. Now, Jack Johnson, who is this heavyweight champ and a tough guy, he just flaunts this. He is out there. He's in the spotlight. Reporters are taking pictures of him, and he constantly has one white girl or another on his side. Apparently, sometimes he would go in with other white boxers that were his friends, and they'd go to really high-end brothels when they'd visit New York City or Chicago. And because he was the heavyweight champ, like, they normally wouldn't let any black guys into a party house like that. He would get in because he was the heavyweight champ, but he was always told, don't you dare touch any of the women. Don't touch these white girls. And of course, he would get in and then he would just disregard it and do whatever he wanted, which would often get him into trouble. He was always like immersed in controversy. And people that, they were kind of the more mainstream, mainline racists of the day, they hated this about him. On the one hand, they hated that a black guy was the heavyweight champ. On the other hand, it's not just any normal black guy that's like kind of, humble and, quiet and just a hard worker. It was a guy that like flaunted everything. He would go around and he would wear essentially white people's clothes. He would drive white people's cars, and he would take white women as his wife. So you can see where this is a really interesting situation, because he's just going against all of the cultural norms, and he's totally unapologetic about it. And he's a trash talker. Over a dozen times in his life, he nearly gets lynched. He had lynch mobs come after him more than once, but he was always able to stay one step ahead of them. He would have personal security and bodyguards. He would kind of stay on the move. Of course, if it was just one person coming at him or 2 people, he could probably beat the snot out of them because of how tough he was. But think about it. I don't care how tough you are. If you have a mob of 30 angry dudes showing up at your door and they all have guns and pitchforks, doesn't matter how good a boxer you are, that's not going to save you. I think one of the most miraculous things about his story is that he never got lynched, that he actually survived and, and got through this period when he was kind of flaunting all of these norms and doing what he wanted. So kind of sum him up that he was a party guy. I don't care how you word all that stuff, but I want you to know that about him. He's not the guy, and he would say this, like, I'm not up here to be a role model for your kids. You shouldn't like tell them to be just like me, that I'm up here to win money. That's what I'm doing. This is my career, and I'm really good at it. And I would like to do what I like to do, and I'm going to party in my free time and spend my money. And that's that. So let me think here. There's one other thing. Oh, my favorite story about him. So here you see him down in the race car. All right. He apparently loved fast cars and would always drive over the speed limit. Well, one time he was by himself driving down south. I think it was in maybe Virginia or North Carolina. Not quite sure on exactly where this happened at. But he was going like 30 miles an hour over the speed limit. So, I mean, it was like a 55 road and he's going 85, 90, zooming through there, and a police officer pulls him over. So it's a black guy in a really nice car. Cop pulls him over. Now, back in this time, often like there was more corruption in police departments, and you could actually, in a lot of states, it was legal to pay for your speeding ticket right when you got pulled over. Okay. Now, the police officer pulls him over. White cop. There's Jack Johnson in his sports car, comes up and it says, "Where do you think you're going, boy? You're going pretty fast, huh?" And Johnson says, "Yeah, I guess I was speeding a little bit. I like to go fast. It's my new car." And the cop says, "Well, yeah, you're going way too fast, and I'm going to have to write you up for this. It's a ticket." And Johnson says, "So how much is it for the speeding ticket that I just took?" And the cop says, $50, which today's money, that's probably $500. That's a ridiculously priced, very high price speeding ticket. Well, Jack Johnson, being that he's the heavyweight champ and has stacks of cash on him, he whips out a wad of bills, all hundreds, and he peels off $100 bill and gives it to the cop. And the cop says, "What are you, crazy? I don't have $50 change here." And I guess without missing a beat, Jack Johnson says, "Oh, no, you keep it all, because I'm going to be coming back through this way in about 2 hours, and I'm going to be going the same speed. So I'm prepaying my next one." And he takes right off. What a guy, huh? As soon as I heard that story about him, I'm like, I really like this guy. He's an interesting character. But he is a mixed bag too. You know what I mean? There's a lot of things I very much admire about him. There's also some things I think has some personality flaws and was kind of, I don't know that I would necessarily say he's the best role model for kids, but man, he's an interesting guy. So if you're ever looking to do a report on like a sports hero, look into Jack Johnson. He is his whole story, like I could literally talk about him for hours, but you could dig into his story, and he's got all kinds of crazy cool stories about him like that. Next thing I want you to put in your notes here. He becomes an icon in the black community. Now, a lot of white people were upset that he was the heavyweight champ and didn't like the way he lived his life. But think about it. Within the black community, he becomes a hero. He's the first guy to, like, in one of the main sports, baseball and boxing are the two really big sports at the time. And in Major League Baseball is still segregated. There are no black guys in MLB. He's the first black guy to exceed in one of these like white sports type leagues, and everybody sees it, and he's controversial. So, a lot of black people, I think, like questioned his morals a little bit, because most of the black community at the time was pretty religious and kind of devout and very conservative in their personal lives. But man, they loved that this guy was out there just kind of shaking things up, and he becomes a total hero within the black community. All right. Next up, here's my follow-up, and I'll start wrapping it up. There's a picture of Jack with his wife. Apparently, he was with all kinds of women all the time, and that led to some dicey times in his marriages, and he got divorced multiple times too. But anyway, where I'm wrapping it up, kind of with his story, and after telling you a little bit about this interesting guy, I want you to take away from it, racism is totally different 100 years ago as opposed to today. The racism of the early 1900s is so much more intense, glaring, and mainstream than anything out there in America today that I can see. Another interesting little side note, the other guy did a deep profile of in this class was Teddy Roosevelt. Well, actually, this was after Roosevelt had been president. Okay, so he was out, and this is around the time where he's running for that third term, and he doesn't get it, where he was like the Bull Moose candidate. I guess Johnson and Roosevelt became pretty good friends. Both quirky personalities. You remember Roosevelt really, really loved and respected all of the martial arts, judo, jujitsu, all the fighting stuff, boxing, of course, too. So Roosevelt absolutely thought that this guy was pretty spectacular. And even though Roosevelt had some he had some racist views by today's standards. If you were going to look at him back in that time, some of the things that he thought would have been openly racist today. But remember, for the times when he lived, Roosevelt was actually fairly progressive. He had the first black guy to come dine at the White House as a guest, Booker T. Washington. And even though Roosevelt was kind of somewhat racist by today's standards, he also felt 100% that exceptional people came in all races. And he thought that, there are white people out there that are total morons and losers, and there are black people out there that are like really awesome, good people that are exceptional and talented. So for all that considered, I guess Roosevelt actually did hold Jack Johnson in very high regard and thought he was a stellar athlete, was kind of a fan of Jack Johnson, and they met and talked and chit-chatted several times, both of them being kind of larger-than-life figures and very well-known celebrities for different reasons. His title was the biggest thing they say to happen to the black community since the end of slavery. So I already told you he was kind of like an icon in the black community, and he was idolized and a hero. Put this in there in some way, shape, or form. That, I've heard this quoted by multiple people, and I don't think this is necessarily an exaggeration. If you go from the end of slavery, 1865, on through to 1900, the norm was racism. In a lot of ways, the black community was almost no better off in that 30-year chunk of time. They were still, even though they were not slaves, they were still very much oppressed and held to a different standard in society. This is the first time you see a black person really, really excel and just kind of give a big middle finger to kind of all the racist norms out there in society. So for that, he is idolized, and it really is a big deal. And it gives he breaks a glass ceiling, and he gives a lot of black kids kind of hope and gives them a little courage and a hero and something to shoot for. The Mann Act. Now, this was a law that I think maybe had good intentions. It was trying to prevent prevent prostitution and human trafficking. So you would get in big trouble if you took a unwilling woman across state lines. Now, often this law, which was a federal law, was applied to kind of target and discriminate against black guys. So Jack Johnson, who was actually married to a white woman, he got charged with violating the Mann Act, and this is while they're married, because he had driven across state lines in a car with his white wife, who is pictured right there. Apparently, her parents, who did not like Jack Johnson and did not approve of the marriage, they called and filed charges, and Johnson actually got arrested and thrown in jail for a while for violating the Mann Act, because it was it was because he was a black guy traveling with a white woman and went across state lines. Now, it's a bogus charge, because was he taking across the state lines as, somebody that he abducted, or was he selling her into prostitution or anything? No, for God's sakes, he's married to her. And she didn't even press the charge. She was willingly driving with them. But they locked him up, just to how different the times were. And he gets thrown into jail for a while and fights it. And eventually he's able to get out of jail for it. And his attorneys kind of help him out. But openly racist law. Skipping ahead to my last point here. Actually, President Trump posthumously, a couple years ago, pardoned Jack Johnson, because he had always had that on his criminal record, even though he's been dead for a long time. An interesting thing, and something I commend President Trump for, he actually pardoned Jack Johnson, even though he was dead, for his violation of the Mann Act. And Trump basically came out and said, you know what? That was a bunch of BS. He shouldn't have been charged for that. That was just different times, and Jack Johnson's a hero, and he shouldn't have that on his record. So a symbolic thing. Then I guess racism followed him right up to his dying days. He ends up losing the heavyweight title after holding it for a really long time. His story is pretty interesting. He was over in Europe after that when World War I breaks out, and he gets stuck in continental Europe while this war is erupting. He ends up getting out of there. Like I said, there's a whole lot more to his story that I didn't cover here. Anyway, years later, he's retired. He lives fairly comfortably. He's still driving fast cars. Apparently, in 1947, he pulled up into a diner in North Carolina, which I think was where he lived at the time, and they refused to serve him at the diner. And he was one that, like, he didn't care about any of these Jim Crow laws or anything. He was going to live his life how he wanted to live it, and to hell with you if you didn't approve of it or you didn't like him or whatever. So he went in and sat at the whites only counter, and the waitress said, "We're not going to serve you, boy. You need to get out of here. You can go get your food around back," because they would give black people, they would let them buy food around back, but they couldn't sit in there with the other white customers. Well, I guess he was furious about that. It's like, this is nuts. You know what I mean? You're kidding me. I've been dealing with this my whole life. And he leaves that diner in a big hurry, and he was speeding down the road, and he got into a horrible car accident where he hit like a bridge, like some sort of concrete structure going like 90 miles an hour. So unfortunately, that was the end of Jack Johnson. Very tumultuous life. I hope you enjoyed his story. I think he's a super interesting guy. And then we will have a follow-up quiz about the racism notes that I had hit last week, and then a little bit of the Jack Johnson story. So if you got your notes with you and you've watched the lectures, you should do great on that. All right, see ya.